Uh, Good evening, everyone. I think you can all hear me. I can hear myself, so hopefully it's working. I'm really, really grateful, honoured to be here. It's a privilege to see the audience. Occasionally, very rarely, I presented in bigger audiences, but usually the classes over about 15 years, two universities, usually smaller audiences, industry professionals. So I'm going to talk through almost a kind of research as part of the PhD. It's a never-ending ongoing story. Hopefully it may or may not finish even, but at least there's some research being done, and hopefully you get something out of it that hopefully will be beneficial at least to some of you. Well, before I start taking you through, there's quite a few slides, there's some visuals, and some of it is also just to, I just need to hopefully it'll work better. So, by all means, along the way, I used to say this to a class of people, do challenge what I say. Sometimes I'll be just a messenger because I might just quote somebody else's work. Other times I might be maybe saying something controversial or opinionated. And if you wish, do heckle or even stop and ask questions. Maybe it might sound a bit unusual for a lecture, but let's do it as interactive as possible. I used to usually also ask people questions even through an online polling tool, but I'm not going to do that. But at least I will show you some examples of when I collected data like that, via that way, from people in events like this, in various conferences and seminars. So before I start, just for me to get a kind of understanding of the audience, and I'm not going to ask personal questions, but are there any current or former pilots in the room? Show of hands? Okay. Obviously, one of the centres in the country that's sort of renowned for its kind of design, manufacturing background and everything else, but it's a very much kind of, the studies that I've done is very, about more operational, but hopefully some of that information may, kind of makes you think that some of it may be relevant to other parts of the aerospace wider industry, not only airline world or maintenance organizations. So, let me just take you through some slides. Here's my disclaimer. Thank you for the nice introduction, Neshe, but I currently work at North Atlantic Airways as a safety manager, and of course I'm also associated with International Federation of Airworthiness, UK Flight Safety Committee, and past affiliations with other organizations, but everything I'm going to say is either cited someone else's work or purely my own opinion. I just want to make that absolutely crystal clear. So I wanted to start these three questions actually, sort of, because the title talked about sort of risk and culture, but ultimately the study that I've been doing is almost about risk culture, and I know that C word, and every time we talk about it, people even just get really, oh, that C word again, the culture, very, very controversial in some cases. There are actually, some people love it, some people hate it, some people actually think that there's not such a thing, safety culture, doesn't exist. There are quite diverse views about it, but that was my kind of starting point. But of course I got fascinated by the risk and the culture element of risk and so on. So first question is, why risk? Why I've been fascinated by risk, if you like. There's some quotes there. The first one is, for example, safety is increasingly viewed as safety management of risk, and that's from an ICAO document which was published early 2000s. So even starting from 20 years ago, we started seeing safety not all about lack of accidents or serious incidents, critical industry. Sometimes other words are used as well, but clearly in the aviation domain, we see risk as typically with two components: the severity and actually the probability or likelihood of a hazard causing an undesired outcome. But I think there's also another perspective of this whole risk, because despite the fact that in the aviation industry we design products and we operate them and maintain them with safety and risk in mind, but the word risk inevitably is a much wider construct, right? I hope you would agree with me. When we talk about risk, we talk about not only safety, we talk about financial risk, losing money, we talk about environmental risk, we talk about reputational, legal, and the list goes on. So when you try to combine the two together, like safety and risk, of course we talk about safety risk, but actually we need to see the risk as a much wider construct. So I was fascinated by his work. Professor John Adams, basically I've actually visited in his house in London. I'm not sure if he's still with us, but certainly I think it's been very controversial. And actually created this model based on another academic's work in Canada. But ultimately, again, I hope you would agree with me that it's all, when you talk about risk management, it's a balancing act. Because we try to make decisions based on lots of different trade-offs. And also, I love this, the one at the bottom here talks about, I know it's playing with words, but compulsive risk assessment psychosis. So there's this increasing desire to almost, we're going to do something, or have you done a risk assessment? And then we inevitably go and carry out a risk assessment, document it in one way or the other, and almost kind of legally protect ourselves that, oh, we're going to do something potentially unsafe, because that's the nature of life. And then to protect ourselves even from a legal perspective, we almost sometimes even normalize that risk and say, oh, okay, we conducted a risk assessment, now it's safe to do it. Or at least we justify or try to. But I think that's where it's coming from. So this is typically ICAO definition of risk, and not my words. The ICAO, as you know, the International Civil Aviation Organizations, global panels create even these words, definitions, sometimes takes years. I've been involved in some of the EASA work that we go to working groups, and then it takes sometimes almost 10-15 minutes that we try to wordsmith a single sentence. But anyway, this is the definition that they came up with. Obviously, again, the likelihood and the severity is the two components of risk, right? That's how they see it. But clearly, we're talking about hazards, and then we're talking about risks. Hazards is something that we can say see all around us as they're present, but actually risk, in one concept, it lives in the future, because we're talking about the probability. And if any of us can predict what's going to happen either in this country or in the Middle East or globally, whether political or environmental perspective or otherwise, we wouldn't be here, right? So it's that prediction is inevitably creates what I call, we can look at the risk slightly differently. I'm not completely against that definition and two components, but I think if you consider, when you look about the risk, inevitably we're talking about a level of uncertainty, because we're trying to predict something bad happening. But at the same time, when you actually consider this, inevitably you're also talking about opportunities. I'm not only talking about saving costs or winning and money and earning money and so on. In some cases, actually operating safely is an opportunity if you actually manage risks well. Because last thing we want is the ultimate risk-free environment is we don't operate, right? The safest aircraft is the aircraft on the ground. Let's be honest. So all of these functions, also all of these phrases, I think, again, I hope you completely different things. And it would be based on so many different factors. So, some examples very, very quickly. Think about it, what was acceptable then? It's not acceptable today. And if you think about, even in some cases, from our health and safety world, that what was acceptable even 10 years ago, forget about half a century ago or longer, is not acceptable today, because that's the society we live in. Of course, there's a sort of the kind of cultural aspect of it, that what's acceptable in one country would not be tolerated in another country. Again, I'm not trying to be stereotypic, but these are the realities that I think we all recognize. And then this is basically Fukushima. Think about it, that before the event, some countries around the world, and they were all using nuclear energy, and then immediately after the event, there were some countries, it's a choice, they made a conscious decision and a policy decision, we're going to move away from it, while other countries said, no, we're going to continue as we are. So I think the key point is, pre and post a very significant event also has a considerable impact on our way of looking at risk, our perception of risk, and our attitude towards risk. And then, of course, we make personal choices, right? I cycled in London for about 7 years when I commuted day in, day out, in and out of London. And I used to use Boris bikes every day in those days. And I never wore a mask. I never wore a protective gear, like many other people. It's personal choices. So, just a couple of more words about why culture. I won't go through each and every one of them, but I chose some well-known academics or business leaders. The one on the left is Gerd Hofstede, done a lot of work about culture studies. The one in the middle is Southwest Airlines charismatic CEO, Gallagher, and then the Peter Drucker. Apparently Peter Drucker never said that. There's an institute, as part of this sometimes when you start doing research, you have to find the right source to be able to cite it. And I went all the way to Peter Drucker Institute and said, can you give me a reference? And they said, it never said that. But it's widely used. But I think the culture, for those of us who believe that there's something out there, because Herb Keller is arguing it's definitionally elusive, what is the meaning of it, what's the definition? But it's an enabler for managing safety and risk. Again, a lot of people argue strongly that without the safety culture and focusing on it and improving it, with a positive culture, without it, it's almost impossible. I won't go through that, but basically there's videos out there that talks about it. You know it when you see it. I think there's one example that my boss used to use in Cranfield. People just literally, when they do their job and then they're actually saluting the aircraft literally departing. Doesn't happen, does it, in every country? But it's one of those things that actually you feel it, but you can't even put clear words to it and say, this is it, this is culture, right? Part of the culture. So, and of course, the other question I came with, the third one, is why risk culture? I'm so sorry. I do apologize. Human factors, right? I put my sort of charger, but I didn't switch it on. So, I won't read the quotes, but Dame Mary Douglas, I don't know if you ever heard about her, but she's actually quite an influential sociologist. And she's done a lot of work on culture in the early days, about culture and also risk aspect of it, and also John Adams. But I think if you read the quotes, my conclusion out of all of that is, I think our common understanding of think about our experiences during the pandemic. There were lots of commentators and lots of policies and lots of politicians as well as academics that they were all bombarding us with lots of statistics about fatality rates, about the probability of this and probability of that, and it was almost kind of, you didn't know who to believe. I think these are really important, and in an organization also, how we understand at different levels, how we communicate risk at different levels is vital for its effective management. I'm going to quickly go through. Oops. Let's see. So this is well-known James Reason. Probably everyone heard about Swiss cheese. Apparently he went to a tower in Canada and they introduced him with the app process. Oh, you the Swiss cheese man. And obviously he's been extremely influential, and even 40, 50 years later, his Swiss cheese model is still, some people argue, still very valid. Other people say, well, it's in a complex world, so we're living in a different world. But I sort of later looked, it can be basically described as sort of 4 components of a positive informed safety culture, and I thought that maybe what he's not focusing on is actually, there might be a 5th element, just like Haddon and Cave talked about questioning culture instead of risk culture. But of course, when you start digging deeper in what's out there, even 4 or 5 years after I started looking at literature, because that's the first thing you do as an academic, I actually realized even James Reason himself, in a Royal Aeronautical Society event, gave a presentation about risk culture. So, again, you know, sometimes we think inevitably as human beings, and then we read, we're influenced, and then suddenly you realize that you're not the first one who, you know, talked about it. If you go a bit further, actually, who coined, because talking about literature reviews, you then almost go into digging deeper. In 1995, post-Chernobyl, because Chernobyl is also very much referenced when it was first time safety culture was started being the discussions. And out of those atomic agency events, take a look at this. Basically, this was a paper out of those. And some of the things that we actually look at today, integrated rather than fragmented risk management. There's a lot of talk about that in EASA and other part of the industry. We talk about risk-based regulation today. They talked about it in 1995. And then at the bottom, the paper also makes an attempt to raise awareness regarding the human dimension component in the operational risk model, and says it concludes the proposed tripod is achievable only if accompanied by a swift shift to a risk culture, which is introduced as in a conceptual form. So it's not something new. That's what I'm trying to get at, I guess. We sometimes think that some of the stuff we're discussing today is something we started discussing the last 10, 15 years, actually goes all the way back, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years, or even beyond. So, I'm going to, before I start sharing the actual various parts of the studies and the data, what the data looks like, I'm going to try to talk only one thing. In fact, instead of talking about it, I don't know, anyone in the audience, have you ever heard about Cynefin framework? No? Okay, so it's a huge topic, and it's actually a framework. Dave Snowden, someone's been very influential and full of material online, but I'd like, instead of me trying to articulate it, I'd like to show a video, and obviously this is just a decision-making framework that he originated in early 2000s, one of these infographics, very sort of busy, I'm afraid. But let's take a look at this video. Maybe I think there's a relevance to risk, and that's what I like, at least in my mind. But let's see if this is going to work.
Let's imagine, if you can, that you've got to organise a party for a bunch of 11-year-old boys, and you want to apply the 3 different types of system that apply in nature. Well, if you assume the party's chaotic, the children are acting at random, you might as well buy the drugs and alcohol so the children can go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Your house may burn down in the process, but what does that matter? All property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place. I have friends in California who've tried this. I don't recommend it. The recovery cost is high, but it's a legitimate approach. On the other hand, the one we'll be more familiar with is the order systems approach. Here, it's of critical importance to construct clearly articulated learning objectives in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should, of course, be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong. Ideally, you should print the learning objectives off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and place those around the room where you're going to hold the party. You then produce a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. Once you've done that, the senior adult can start the party with a motivational videotape. After all, you don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives of the party itself. And then they should use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the objectives of the party and to show the children how pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone target. Now, of course, the third approach, the complexity approach, is even simpler. Here we draw a line in the sand known as a boundary in complexity theory, and we turn to the children and say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. We then use catalytic probes, and I'm deliberately using a jargon of complexity theory now. Football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, something which will stimulate a pattern of activity which is called an attractor. And if it's a beneficial attractor, we stabilise it, we amplify it. If it's a negative attractor, we dampen it or destroy it fairly quickly. So what we do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And in that simple phrase, we see the promise of complexity theory for organisations and government alike.
So, I hope I won't get into trouble by using the video, but it's publicly available. And I think I've had a chance to speak to him in a couple of occasions, but certainly I've been fascinated by the Cynefin framework, but the complexity. There's so much discussion, debate going on out there, because there's also about systems thinking, systems theories and all of that. But anyway, I won't go too much into that, but certainly some of the stuff that I've done was certainly influenced because we were all stuck in at homes in the pandemic, and I was fascinated by the start of reading, watching, listening more, and then I then applied some of the principles, not only the Cynefin framework, but also how you then try to collect data from people, not ask them to ask 50 questions to answer a survey, but also trying to collect narratives, and they call it Anthro-complexity, sorry for the jargon again, but the idea is you're trying to combine all the complexity theory, but also anthropology from an anthropological perspective. Anyway, so I'm conscious of time. I just want to show you some really what we've done. In fact, when I say what we've done, I've done some work, but I can't take all the credit because some of it was collaborative work as well. So I want to take you through this. So the first one, I just want to share with you what I've done in 2016 and 17. I've done two studies, two surveys, or I designed questionnaires, like you can say, with a Google form. And basically, these two surveys focused on this whole idea of, without even first understanding what Cynefin and Anthro-complexity was about, I was fascinated by this question of acceptable level of risk or acceptable risk, acceptable level of safety. And I said to people, not necessarily interviews, but I said, look, two key questions for you. One of them is, tell me a scenario, a lived experience, and you looked at a situation and you had to make a judgment call and you tolerated a level of risk. Of course, there's sort of when people in the operational environment, it means something to some people, but it doesn't mean some other people. But nevertheless, I've got some responses. And of course, the other question was that tell me a situation situation or a story or scenario that actually you looked at a situation and you say, today we wouldn't go to this destination because of a short runway with this aircraft and with this deferred defect, but on another day we might go. So it's almost kind of trying to capture those people's kind of understanding of risk and also the judgment calls that they made. So what came out of that, lots of other there were sub-questions around even on-time performance. Whether the actual on-time performance targets, like airline industry is driven by absolutely on-time performance because of, in some cases, passenger rights legislation, because it costs airlines big money. And then my question was, is it actually causing people to tolerate risks that they shouldn't be tolerating? People are actually making judgment calls to fly an aircraft when they shouldn't be flying. The good news is that these are very, very rare events. But in some cases, I looked at these stories and I tried to classify them because the data was only collected by pilots and engineers. Inevitably, these are the classifications. But most of them were about sometimes defects, how you can manage them or how you can defer them, or even repetitive defects. In some cases, in the airline industry nowadays, still a very topical issue about fuel planning and how much fuel you carry. All of those decisions or diversion decisions were actually where the stories or the scenarios, people had to make some judgment calls, and to a degree they had to tolerate some level of risk. So I then tried to categorize them in a slightly different way, take a look at this based on potential outcome. So in other words, some of those cases that people shared, stories, what kind of accident categories they could have caused. The typical key accident cases like loss of control, runway excursions, or in-flight fire, for example, flying through storms during an approach can potentially cause a loss of control event. Or in other cases, tailwind landing. You may end up with a deal with the runway. Still, runway excursion is probably the highest frequency event still today. And that's been like that for many years. And then also, one of my colleagues was a captain, and he said, actually, look at them from different perspective. And what about these decisions made in different phases of the flight? Sometimes people make decisions before flying. Sometimes they have to make even tough choices, split-second decisions, during a landing. So inevitably, it's a very complex process, the aeronautical decision-making. Some of my colleagues at Cranfield, psychologists and so on, they do that kind of study, but it's very, very complex. I didn't want to focus on that too much, but inevitably people shared wide range of stories or real lived experiences. And then of course, Daniel Kahneman, fast and slow thinking, whether when you're going to try to make a decision which involves some level of risk, do you have time to sleep on it and try to gather a bit more information so that you make that decision tomorrow? But in some cases, those aeronautical decision-making examples that you can't just say we're going to park aside and we're going to think about it and then make a decision, because you have to make it almost split second, whether to continue approaching or actually go around. So anyway, I was just literally looking at these stories and you can look at the examples. So one of the other things, basically what came out of that in 2016 was, I call the organizational risk behavior framework. Could have called something else, slightly different worded, but basically it was a framework. So I think the framework, certainly first of all, it was influenced by Adam Cave. I'm sure many of you heard about it or know him or even read the Nimrod Review and so on. And certainly I think on the 25th anniversary of Piper Alpha, he was invited to give a talk. And in that talk, he talked about, he gave a lecture, and he talked about 4 states of man. And I'm going to explain that in a minute, but certainly this particular kind of framework was influenced based on his idea, not mine. contact him to have a conversation, but I wasn't able to reach him. But nevertheless, I don't know what this kind of statement means to you, but I think my fundamental premise for this framework is, as it says, our understanding of risk influences our risk appetite or our attitude towards risk. So if you better understand it, we have a slightly different approach, how we manage it. And in some cases, if you don't understand it well enough, sometimes we might make different decisions. Anyway, let me just come to that. So certainly, as I mentioned, that's Having Cave. I can't, credit to him that these are all originally his words because I looked for it. And so basically, these are the 4 words that he used. His argument is much more, rather than cultural, much more individual. And he's saying that a person can be risk ignorant, risk cavalier, or risk averse, or risk sensible. So of course the ideal position should be that we should make more risk sensible decisions rather than, because each and every one of the others, 3, has almost some unintended consequences, shall we say. So what came out of that is building this framework. Let me just, I call it typology of organizational risk behavior. So you either have a good understanding of risk or you don't understand it well enough. And then based on that, we may have a very high risk protection or reduce our exposure, or otherwise, completely the opposite. So the first one is this whole risk ignorant thing. I don't know and I don't want to know. And that's almost kind of Margaret Hefner, I think her name is, she's got a lot of material out there. She talks about willful blindness. And it's almost kind of you deliberately ignoring. I don't know how many people I'm going to alienate. Star Trek and Star Wars fans. But so risk is our business, says Captain Kirk. So it's a bit like risk cavalier approach to life. Well, it may end up with an incident or even an accident, right? And then if you don't understand the risk well, sometimes what we do is we become too risk averse, right? Because we immediately say, oh, let's stop. We don't understand it, let's stop. But we, instead of trying to better understand it, we say, well, we'll stop immediately. But of course, in a tough world, it may have very kind of adverse financial implications, which may in fact, my fundamental argument is, which may impact our ability to manage risks in front of us, because if we're incurring so much cost, we become too risk averse, and actually almost it becomes unviable, not viable to be able to manage risks. And of course the ideal solution is the understanding risk well and making informed and balanced risk decisions, and hopefully that gives us a better opportunity to manage those risks well. Anyway, so that's the kind of gist of the whole kind of 4, what those 4 look like, or at least how I see them. But of course each and every one of these phrases and terms may mean different things to each and every one of you. And that's sometimes the biggest challenge about risk. So let me make this absolutely crystal clear, because I just want to. So the aim is not to label an organization, a group of professionals, pilot versus engineers versus articles or whatever, or this department or that department, or this organization or that organization. So that is not the aim of this whole idea, that by trying to somehow collect data and then we just put a label on an organization and say, oh, you risk ignorant or you risk averse or whatever it may be. That is not. And so the aim is almost to identify operational risk decisions. So in other words, that by capturing people's lived experiences, listening to their stories, how they make decisions in challenging circumstances, and how they see risk, then we would have an opportunity to be able to not necessarily put a label on each and every one of those, but actually we can put them and map them in this whole framework, if you like. And hopefully that gives us opportunities to move towards a much more risk-sensible position. So, what did we do then? This was all about sort of collecting some data, initial data, that gave me an opportunity to look at what the data looks like, develop a framework, and then what we're going to do with the framework. That was the next question. So in 2021, unfortunately in the middle of pandemic, and colleagues, because we were all stuck at home and lots of phone calls and Zoom calls and team calls, lots of different discussions and webinars, and we said maybe we could do something and try to understand in the middle of pandemic. You remember the days that we used to fly with the masks on? While the actual, even sometimes even flight deck crew wore masks, but certainly the cabin crew used to wear masks, and they used to give even you the sort of announcement and say, in the unlikely event an oxygen mask and depressurization, you need to take your mask off before you put your oxygen mask on. So those days. So we literally wanted to better understand how challenging the circumstances that people was working through. So that's basically a collaborative study we called it Making Sense of Aviation Safety, because Cynefin also talks about sense making and this whole anthro-complexity theory ideas. So, and it was 3 organizations. We launched a study, we designed it. I think, in my view, it was almost captured an element of risk culture study to try to test almost the framework. And by the way, I'll share these slides, anyone interested. There's some material available online, previously recorded events, because we kind of covered, presented the outcome of that studies in a much more detailed way, which I won't be able to present here in detail. So these are all in an L3 Harry 6 seminar. We just literally discussed the results of that. But just to give you a flavour of what kind of questions that we were asking, and this is literally the SenseMaker tool. I'm not trying to do a commercial promotion of it, but fundamentally, instead of asking people how likely or unlikely and how disagree and all of those kind of Likert scales and so on, we ask people some fundamental statements and then some almost controversial questions, and then ask them to say where they see it. So in this particular example, we said they first shared a lived story, lived experience, after sharing their experience, and then they answered these questions. So in this example, we say, look, okay, after sharing your story, we want you to reflect on your story and say, in this situation, we chose to. They strictly stayed within procedures. And then at the bottom on the left, they deviate slightly from procedures. And then on the right, that there was no SOPs to follow to cover that eventuality. And they had to come with a novel solution. There's no scales. It's just basically a dot in the middle of a blank triangle. They really need to move that dot and leave it somewhere wherever they feel right. It feels right to them. So, but what it does, think about it, there's these patterns emerging, isn't there? There's a group of things at the top that say, the good news is a lot of people are actually following the SOPs. There's a group here on the left-hand side, which actually says, well, they slightly deviated for whatever reason. Now the point is, then I can click on one of those dots and I can go and see the actual story. What was the circumstances and what was the detail. So it's almost in the academic world, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone, but there's this almost sometimes polarization. Some people love quantitative research, quantitative data analysis, other people love qualitative. People even ask you questions, are you a qualitative or quantitative researcher? But actually what this is trying to do is just combine the two together, which gives you sort of some level of visualization, or even you can break them down to percentages and so on. But the most importantly, when we talk about safety and risk, that context makes all the difference. So, I'm going to flick through some examples here. Take a look at this one. Decision-making pressure, as we all know, commercial pressure or other pressures, always impact on people's decision-making. pressure when there's actually somebody sick at home, or I've even got, believe it or not, examples of people saying, well, I was fatigued, but I had to come back home because we had a dinner plan with the guests. Right? So sometimes people even make choices for personal reasons, not necessarily for organizational gain or whatever. And of course, in some cases, the actual customer, as a passenger, we put pressure on people, and it in fact influences their decision making. And then risk was managed by avoiding it, tolerating it, or even mitigating it. Again, there were different patterns. So all of these dots actually a different story. So you can go and literally further analyze and further understand what the context was. So, of course, we also used this framework asking people this question. So what we said to them, look, you share the story, you analyze your story by asking these triangular or dyad questions and so on. But what we would like you to do is think about where you see, as me, put a dot in this blank canvas. As you can see, on each corner, it's risk ignorant, risk cavalier, risk sensible, and risk averse. And there's no scale. There's no boundaries, right? Just put a dot wherever it feels right to you. And then the second dot you're going to put, because these are all just movable things on an online survey, what you think that actually your co-workers, your colleagues, think about that scenario. And then the third question was also, the third dot was what you think about the management. So I know it looks messy, right, at the moment. So, but this is what it looked like. Because you can also filter these in and out, and you can always look at what me says, what we looks like, and what co-workers look like. So, if you think about it, on the left-hand side, it's all the dots about me. Right? So a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people thought that, oh, they made perfectly sensible decisions. Where actually, their co-workers and their colleagues, they thought sometimes they have a different attitude. And then of course, I hope, maybe I'm talking to some managers, and I actually presented this in a group of a similar number of senior managers in a big organization. And I just look, I respect what you do, but this is the problem, because, not problem, but this is a gap that we need to recognize. So in other words, some people think that while they're making sensible decisions, actually management's attitude towards that particular risk in the organization's facing is actually they're ignoring it. So, do I believe that the management, because now, dare I say, I am part of that management team, I'm not the whole decision maker in our organization, but inevitably I'm the facilitator for the management to make the better informed decisions. As a safety manager, I present the data to risk owners, this is what we call. But fundamentally, there is this gap that what the frontline people think and what the management think. And I think that brings me back to the original question about common understanding of risk. Do I believe for a second that we will be able to achieve 100% everyone understands it in the same way? Of course not. But I think the more we bridge that gap, I think we have a better chance to improve a better and effective risk management. So, I'm conscious of time, apologies for taking quite a bit of time, but so what we've done also, you remember the stories that I collected in 2016 and 17 survey. So I put some of those in an event in 2023 to a group of audience, which majority of them are actually pilots. So I said to them, why don't you, I give you a narrative, and sometimes very short, but at least just a trial, maybe not so scientific, but fundamentally put a dot in this blank canvas. So let's take a quick look at a couple of things. So the first one is actually something that I had done in the same organization arranged in 2017. is the story in the early days of the study that I was using as an example that how our risk perception can differ and how our decisions are influenced. I don't know if any of you are aware, have you heard of Flight 268? So basically this is a 747 out of Los Angeles in 2005-6. Only a few months after the first time the passenger rights legislation was introduced, and basically they had an engine surge at liftoff, and they shut the engine down. They followed the procedure, the checklist, and they shut down the engine. It's a perfectly controllable aircraft, and basically then they now have the dilemma to make a decision whether to continue or to come back and land back at Los Angeles. And of course, each and every one of those options has its own challenges and risks, because you're going to have to dump tons and tons of fuel, and then potentially come back and do an overweight landing. And of course, if you're going to continue. So what do you think they did? Anyone? I used to ask this question. If you were sitting at the back of the 747 hypothetical scenario, you had this in the IFE, this is what happened, ladies and gentlemen. Should we continue or should we go? Right? Imagine. So, of course, but what they've done is they continued. So, of course, my next question to people was, should I continue? They continued. And of course, sorry, apologies. Of course, when they reached the east coast of US, now they have the second dilemma, whether to continue crossing the Atlantic or they could divert to New York, Boston, Chicago, wherever. And they looked at the weather, they made all the sensible things and to inform themselves better, and they had to make a choice. And they said, we'll continue. So they continued, the weather changed, slightly different winds, and despite the fact that their initial calculations made it happen all the way to Heathrow, unfortunately the weather changed, the winds changed, and then they had to divert to Manchester. And of course when they diverted, then it became public, or at least the authorities knew about it, and then it became very controversial, even between the two regulatory authorities, the FAA and the CAA. And of course the argument is that they've done everything legal, legitimate, in accordance with the SOPs, with the checklist, with the manufacturer's guidelines. Watertight argument. But of course the FAA argued that I'm going to fine you to the operator and say, because you operated an aircraft in unairworthy condition in US airspace. Can you see that even the professionals, probably the two very mature regulatory authorities in the world, they even kind of see what happened quite differently. Anyway, think about this scenario. So what I've done is, I won't go through this, but there's basically a quite detailed reference from this book, Reliable-Centered Maintenance. But what I would say is, basically these kind of things, sometimes the decisions are influenced by the cost the company up to several $100,000 in passenger compensation. Because you and I are entitled up to 600 euros or pounds, I don't know what the figures in the UK now, that's passenger compensation, right? Anyway, so, but when I asked people, these are not public, these are pilots, majority of them are pilots. I said, think about this entire scenario, where would you put this scenario in this blank canvas, in this framework? Do you think that is more of a sort of perfectly sensible decision? Do you think that is a risk-equal decision, risk-happy or risk-averse? Not mine. That's exactly how they marked it. So, I mean, this is the challenge we have, and I know I'm not maybe providing some very clear answers to a problem, but as you can see, that actually the same issue, same narrative, when you ask the people, they just see it quite differently. I'll give you one or two examples and then I'll close. So this is almost looks or sounds like someone playing flight simulator at home. When you read the narrative, it says After waiting for 2 hours, they were on the ground. Only way to land was because they came back and they landed and waited 2 hours because of weather situation. They took off again, they go to their destination. Only way to land was by executing a circling approach with 20 knots tailwind. By the way, 20 knots tailwind is almost beyond limits, right? And breaking off at less than 1,000 foot and turning base at 3 miles, and this was at night and in a mountain area. And easy to try this kind of thing in a flight simulator, right? But I don't want to be sitting in the back of the airplane while they're doing that, do you? And this is a real scenario that was shared. And I was just talking to a colleague earlier on, and actually I presented some of these stories in various training forums and whatever, and then one gentleman said, look, you're giving all this, but probably this is somewhere awkward place in the world, and it wouldn't happen here in Europe and in this day and age. Before I was just trying to defend that, I'm not so sure. Before I did that, actually the person next to you, listen, it is happening. But I think, I don't want to sound like too alarming or scaremongering, but I think these are still very, very rare events. For me, that's an excessive risk-taking. That shouldn't happen. But do I believe that it's happening every day in every organisation? No. But when you think about the bigger picture and also the accident rate and everything else, we don't need any of them, that's for sure. And a couple of maybe others about fatigue. For example, someone literally woke up having only slept 4 hours, but they couldn't report unfit and they literally flew, right? Sometimes these are the realities in our industry. And again, I just want to emphasize, these are very rare, but it is sometimes the reality. And then an engineer made the decision to cut a fire detection wire to prevent false alarms in the flight deck. Again, this is extremely excessive risks that people are actually almost tolerating. But look at the actual picture. Some people say, oh, this is completely risk ignorant. And I don't know, maybe someone was making a joke, and actually put it up as they say, yeah, it was a very sensible decision. And I literally wanted to question and say, well, do you really seriously believe that this is a very sensible decision they made? Anyway, I think I'm nearly there. The last one about TCAS, releasing an aircraft without operating TCAS, because you can still do that in this day and age as a deferred defect, the TCAS traffic collision avoidance system. And I think in a busy airspace, it's really considerable risk. Of course, we've got other protections in the system, no doubt. But again, people see it quite differently. And then there was one about sort of rejected the low-cost flight index, about burning 6 tons of additional fuel. But it was a very long flight, and then the pilot basically, what he or she didn't want to do, after a 13-15 hours flight, I can't remember, there wasn't a figure there, but clearly it's a very long flight, and almost kind of, what's the most critical phases of that flight? The last 15 minutes, right? They're approaching, they're going to land. And actually, they've been away for 13 hours or whatever it is, and of course he's saying that every minute counts, and I'm going to be even in a better condition while I'm doing the final approach. And that's why I have to burn extra 6 tons of fuel. And ironically, sometimes the organization doesn't even question it. But some people, there's also, when we talk about pressure, there's the real pressure, because the organization literally tells people, why have you done this and why have you taken extra fuel? But in some cases, there's actually perceived pressure without the organization, even the organization has full support, that it's the people's perception of it. They say, oh, if I do this, I'm going to be questioned, I'm going to be called in to justify my decision. So there is those kind of challenges. I'm so sorry that if I've overrun, but thank you so much for your attention.